This is one of the most beautiful places on the planet. And to get to experience that as part of my job, it's just incredibly rewarding. And it's places that are just, they're rare. These kind of places are disappearing across our planet.
It is important to protect Ravensworth Farms and Rafter Tea Ranch because these are two really important stepping stones for creating a connected wildlife corridor within the Avon Park Sentinel landscape.
We've seen so much growth in South Florida and surrounding areas. Once a land is turned into rooftops, it's never going to go back in its natural vegetative state.
With 1,000 people moving to the estate on a daily basis, the pressure that creates on farming, on wildlife habitat for very specific species like panther and black bear and the southeastern fox squirrel, that is just a few species that is impacted by this development pressure. Protecting these lands, it is the only way to mitigate, to assist, to help with all of these challenges that we're facing, these threats coming by all this development pressure. That's what I see these easements be so critical into a solution to these threats.
I think cattle ranching probably works better than any other agricultural endeavor as far as preserving the land, the hydrology of the land. What we found out is that we work with Mother Nature instead of against Mother Nature has allowed us to be actually more profitable than if we were trying to control every aspect. And that makes what we do just that much more enjoyable. That's our vision for why conservation easements are so important. Protecting the range from urban encroachment, we're excited about that too, because we think the range is very important to our security and well-being in this country.
We've really created a win-win situation where the landowner gets extra value out of their land to continue the kind of lifestyle and the operations that they run on these ranches, and the military gets a compatible use.
Without landowners, we would not be able to do the work that we do, conserving important natural areas for wildlife and for future generations. This is a great example here in the Avon Park Sentinel landscape of working with partners, agency partners, landowners, but this is just an example of the work we do all across North America and all around the world as the Nature Conservancy.
The weight has been lifted off my shoulders that this property will stay as a cattle ranch into perpetuity.
Right. It is really nice to be with you all here, like live and in person. After the last couple of years, I've done a lot of panels in the last few years, and they've all been virtual, so it's nice to have human-to-human interaction. So I'm Temperince Morgan. I'm the Executive Director of the Nature Conservancy here in Florida, and I see a lot of familiar faces. It's nice to see you all again, and a lot of new faces in the audience. So I want to thank you all for joining us. In this next panel discussion, I've got a great group of panelists, and we're going to focus on talking about the importance of and considerations for a connected landscape. And as you saw from the video that was just on the screen, the Nature Conservancy is committed to landscape scale conservation here in Florida and all around the world. So we're a global conservation organization, and our two highest priorities everywhere we work are protecting biodiversity and tackling climate change. And those issues really come to bear here in Florida with our wildlife corridor. And I want to give one more plug for some of the sessions tomorrow. So Dr. Mark Anderson is a TNC scientist who's going to be presenting in the science track tomorrow at 1:30. And he's going to be presenting on some science he and his team led in recent years to produce the first ever for the entire eastern U.S. They produced a comprehensive map. They pulled lots of different data sources together. They were looking at areas that are important for climate resilience, areas that are important for biodiversity, and areas that are important for wildlife migration and movement. And they synergized all of that information into one map that we're now using and is now actually being expanded for the entire U.S. that lets us know where the most resilient and connected lands are that we need to prioritize as an organization here in Florida and the U.S. And the great news is that map matches almost perfectly here in Florida with the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So we know for multiple reasons and multiple data sets that the land that you see in these maps is critically important to protect. And as you heard Hillary mention, we've had a long history of protection here in Florida. That's great news. We have almost 10 million acres protected as federal, state, or other conservation lands. That's great news. We've protected 2.6 million acres over the years through Florida Forever alone. And I can tell you, when I interact with my colleagues in states all around the US, they're very envious of us. They wish they had had decades of a strong, consistent conservation program in place in their states. But I can also tell you, when I talk to my colleagues about threat and risk, it's a very different story. The threat and risk in our state, the threat of growth, of change, are so much more significant. We have so much greater risk of losing our resources, our economy, and our quality of life here in our state, that we still have a lot of work to do. So we need to build on that tremendous foundation that we have in protected lands in the state that you've seen in the maps, but it's critically important that we work now to connect those dots. Those connections are so important for habitat connectivity, for climate resilience corridors, and we must act together very urgently to make sure, as Mallory said, that we protect those key linchpins while we have a chance. And we have Florida Forever. It's a great tool in our toolbox. It's known, it's proven, and we need to rely on it. There's about an 80% match between the corridor and the Florida Forever lands list. But we know we're going to have to use tools above and beyond Florida Forever. So I'm looking forward to the session over the next few days, talking with all of you about how we use our known tools, Florida Forever, Rural and Family Lands Program, as well as new and innovative approaches to make sure we're taking care of those gaps and those connections while we have a chance. So with that, I've got a fantastic panel for you all. Like I said, we're going to focus in on the importance of connected landscapes. So let me go ahead and introduce the panelists, and I'll ask them to join me as I go here. And I'm going to get started with Betty Osceola. So Betty is the co-owner of Buffalo Tiger Airboats. I think she's sitting over here. She works to inspire a greater appreciation for and the protection of, here she is, of her ancestral home in Florida's Everglades. Her life is ingrained in the area. She spent her upbringing living off the land, hunting and fishing with her father. They got their food from the Everglades, not the grocery store like the rest of us. Betty's deep connection to this land, hi Betty, makes her voice resonate with wisdom and we're doing a little dance up here. And transforms your view of wild Florida and the importance in protecting it. She has appeared in documentaries for National Geographic, CNN, and PBS. Thanks for joining us, Betty. Up next is Dr. Gary Tabor. He's the president for the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. He is an ecologist and a wildlife veterinarian based in Bozeman, Montana, a beautiful place to live. In 2007, he founded the Center for Large Landscape Conservation to help people and institutions make better land use decisions at the scale nature functions. He has worked on behalf of large landscape conservation internationally for over 35 years, 12 years as a leader within the U.S. philanthropic community. His conservation achievements is a really long list. I'm going to highlight a few, include the establishment of the Kabale National Park in Uganda, the establishment of the World Bank's Mountain Gorilla Conservation Trust. He co-founded the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, co-founded Patagonia Company's Freedom to Roam Wildlife Corridor campaign, and co-founded the Practitioners Network for Large Landscape Conservation and the Roundtable of the Crown of the Continent. So tremendous experience. Thank you for joining us. You can see him here on the screen. Excuse me, up next is Maurice Pearson, also known as Mo. Mo serves as senior scientist and vice president for MSC Group, a company of the Montrose Environmental Group. Thanks, Mo. He is a second generation Central Floridian and a graduate of the University of Central Florida. He has worked for both the St. Johns River Water Management District and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, gaining experience developing and implementing wildlife management plan objectives for important species, including the endangered Florida panther, which we've talked about, the wood stork, as well as conducting wildlife population census of the Florida scrub jay, the gopher tortoise, and the sand skink. Mo has served on the Orange County Environmental Protection Commission, the Urban Design Commission, and the Environmental Streamlining Task Force. And most recently, he served on a very important group that many of us know, FDEP's Acquisition and Restoration Council. So thank you for joining us, Mo. And last but certainly not least, Emily Purcell. Emily currently serves as Ducks Unlimited's Director of Conservation Programs for the Southeast and is in her 8th year with DU. Hi, Emily. Emily joined DU in 2014 as a conservation specialist, protecting and stewarding conservation easements, an important topic for us, through the Land Protection Program. She also served as a regional biologist, where she helped implement conservation programs focused on wetlands restoration and enhancement on public and private lands throughout the region from Virginia to Florida. In December 2020, she was promoted to her current position as the Director of Conservation Programs, where she oversees all of Ducks Unlimited's conservation efforts in the South Atlantic states of the southern region. She is a native of the beautiful low country of South Carolina and is an avid outdoorswoman. Thank you for joining us, Emily. All right, and with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to kick my first question over to Gary, who I believe is joining us from Montana. You lucky dog. At any rate, Gary, you have committed 35 years of your life to working on landscape scale conservation, and you've done this work all around the world. You've got a project that you're working on here in our own continent, trying to connect wild lands and wild waters from the from the Yellowstone to the Yucatan. Let me go that direction. Can you tell us a little bit from your experience about the importance of scale and connectivity, and maybe some examples of success stories or innovation at work in some of these places that you've been working around the world?
Thank you, Temperince. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So I apologize for not being a part of the community there. My teenage daughter got COVID, and so I'm stuck in Montana. And while Montana has big wild spaces, we also got winter. And right now it's 19 degrees and a blowing blizzard. So I very much miss not going to Florida and being with you all. So let me just share a couple things. Because I'm a map person, I'm not going to give a presentation, but I just want to orient you with regards to wildlife corridors, large-scale conservation around the world. Can you see?
Yes.
Can you see a map of yourselves, if you will,
Yes.
on your screen? Can you see the Florida Wildlife Corridor?
We do, Gary.
Well, first of all, let's admire and praise what is going on in Florida, because before I talk about what's going on around the world, let's admire what's in your own backyard, which is quite spectacular. And what Maurice said was absolutely inspiring. And the world and your neighbors are building bridges, literally land and sea bridges, to connect with you. And this is the Southeast Conservation Blueprint that many of the Southeast states are working on. And a lot of it built on the science and inspiration that came out of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So what you do in Florida is inspiring a region. And it's inspiring nations, inspiring North America. Temperince, you talked about Mark Anderson's work, but what do you do with all that science? Well, building on the science and resilience that Mark Anderson has created for the Nature Conservancy, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy happens to have its 100th year anniversary of the trail that was designed by Benton McKay, and they are trying to figure out what's the second 100 years. Well, they want to create, and inspired by what's going on in Florida, a national or a climate corridor, a binational corridor with Canada that will protect the watershed for 119 million people that depend on the landscape that is derived from this connected nature. So often we think of corridors just as animals crossing the road or animals crossing landscapes or seascapes, but they're also very important for ecological processes that we depend on, from our traditional cultures to our urban environments. It's critical, and the Appalachian Trail Conservancy has come up with a vision that's building on the success of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So, but you're not alone. This is just 100 of the 400 large landscape efforts that are going on in the US. And I know when you think about what's going on locally, you think maybe that's it. But there's a whole global movement, not just in the US, but around the world, that's trying to figure out how do we save nature in a more fragmented world where climate change is exacerbating the impacts, and that we have to do it with bottom-up collaborative approaches that are solved by local decision makers and local input. And this map that you see is what's called the Network for Landscape Conservation that brings these landscapes together just in the US. And I just recently returned. I married an Australian, and I had to take my kids back to Australia to see their grandparents after a 3-year lockdown because of COVID. But I went to the Sunshine State, that's Queensland, Australia. And if you go to the Sunshine State of Australia, you will find that they are building a parallel effort, a parallel world, half a world away, what they call the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative, to protect the connectivity, not only for wildlife and biodiversity, but protecting the resilience of the landscapes, because Australia, of any continent in the world, is suffering from the ravages of climate change. Let me go back and stop sharing my screen and get to more specific points. You asked what's going on in the world. Just a couple brief other points. One is that when it comes to connectivity conservation, we have the iconic Serengeti in Africa, and that's where we've actually went out and protected a whole ecosystem, a whole migration system. I'm always impressed with what's going on in India, because there are 1,000 tigers left in a highly fragmented landscape where hundreds of millions of people live. And India is inspiring for maintaining these large predators because they're so tolerant to wildlife. In where I live, about an hour outside of Yellowstone National Park, which is celebrating its 150 years, we've protected the first designatively protected wildlife corridor called the Path of the Pronghorn. But a lot of people don't know that that wildlife corridor was a restored corridor. So we can bring this kind of migration back if we're mindful. And in Banff National Park in Canada, the second national park in the world, they created one of the first large wildlife overpasses. And that's been shown to be very effective, tragically effective. Tragic because the Trans-Canada Highway split the national park, but highly effective in mending or healing that split by allowing for a land bridge for species to cross where they could not cross before. And then finally, when you think about examples, I have to put the Florida Wildlife Corridor up there, because a lot of these efforts are big ideas on maps, but few on implementation, and you are really implementing. So thank you for asking me that question.
Well, thank you for those great examples and for that plug for us at the end. You know that went over well here, so thank you, Gary. I'm going to come next to Betty. And Betty, your family has for generations lived in harmony with nature's lands and waters. You grew up in an incredibly unique and iconic landscape, even on the global scale, the Everglades. So what could we learn from you and your family about the importance of these large landscapes and the benefits that we derive from them?
Before I answer the question in my language, as is customary, I'm going to speak a few words. Thank you for giving time for an indigenous person to speak on their perspective, and also thank you for thinking about the wildlife and the landscapes that need to exist and giving them a platform. Thank you. And that's one example that I can give, is that we always acknowledge the environment in which we were in. And too much time, the problems that we're seeing today is not many people acknowledge the natural world around them, which is our landscapes, our wildlife, the greater ecosystem that we are a part of. And human beings forget that I call myself a natural being in a natural world, because when you call yourself a human being, you create that disconnect, because you're just a two-legged animal. We're all animals, but we don't want to think so. And we think we're highly evolved, but I think other animals can teach us more valuable lessons. But I'm fortunate to grow up in a community where from infancy through the rest of your life, we always promote connectivity with the landscape. And we all are, the natural world is our classroom. And we always say that to be good parents, to be good people, you have to watch the world around you, the animals and how they exist. And sometimes people who get too distant can't understand, the scientists understand who study these animals that there's valuable lessons to be learned about the landscape, but not many people do. And for us, we're always taught to be mindful when we go to look for food, only take what we need. When we go to build shelter, it's shelter that works with the environment, not against it. And one of the things that I was fortunate to be able to share with Carlton when he came out to the Everglades is a little glimpse of the life that we live. And if you don't know anything about Carlton, when he calls, there's always something interesting in store. Expect the unexpected. It's always an adventure. But that being said, you know, I'm the last generation of the Miccosukee people and Seminole that have had some form of subsistence living off the land. My early childhood was living off the land. And those of us who, even in this audience, probably understand if you're from a farming community, ranching community, and you depend a lot on the land and you understand the importance of that health. So, you know, not only learning from the indigenous people, but also the communities that still survive from the land, is to understand what economy is. And I have a friend, Alan Stewart, environmental engineer, and I always remember sitting in a meeting trying to stop a project that would have developed further land across the Everglades when we already know the Temperince Trail is a dam. And I remember sitting in the meeting with the mayor of this town, and he made the statement, it always stayed with me, is that economy, that society has strayed so far from the original definition. Economy, the original definition, is taking care of home. And I think this is what the Florida Wildlife Corridor strives to do, is take care of home. Because Florida's economy is, as an airboat tour operator, and also an advocate for my tribe's right to exist in the natural landscape, is to understand that everywhere else across the world, a lot of people have lost their natural landscapes. And being in tourism, ecotourism, you see all those individuals flock to Florida because the United States still has a lot of places where you can see natural landscapes and the wildlife and plant life of those natural landscapes. And they always tell us, continue to protect what you have, because we've lost it and we have to come to you to see it. And unfortunately, when it's on our own backyard, we forget that. But the indigenous people, I can't speak for all indigenous people, but we're always reminded to thank creation every day and be thankful for what you have. And it's very important for wildlife to have a place to exist, because Florida likes to save everything. We want to save the bear, we want to save the panther, we want to save the manatee, but we forget they have to have places to exist and to travel. And if you study bears, you know that just like any other animal, they have their home range, and they go, just like we take vacations, they go back to the other parts of their home range. If you study alligators, you know they go back to another area for mating season, and then they leave. They have to have that place to travel. And so those are things that we are taught, is to how to learn those skills of survival in life, is to be a student of nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Obviously, there's a lot that we can learn from Betty and her family. I'm going to come to you, Mo, next. So with your experience with Florida Forever serving on the Ark, and your experience in water management and wildlife management over the years, can you talk a bit about the role that you think Florida Forever has played in helping us get to this point with the corridor, as well as the role you think it can play as we move forward with trying to put the rest of this puzzle together?
Okay, thanks. Well, full disclosure, my term on ARC began right after the 08-09 crash. So the money wasn't as plentiful during my tenure. But my time there, what I did learn and my experience is that the dedication of the people, Florida Forestry, FWC, Tall Timber, the three individuals who were gubernatorial appointments, they're very dedicated to answering the question and protecting habitat in perpetuity and making those connections. A lot of great projects came in front of us. It's always a tough thing in December to provide a ranking for opportunities that come in front of you. You get some really great projects, and there's a lot of information learned when a group comes to Tallahassee to present a new project for the opportunity of including it on the list, Florida Forever. But what I would say that there is a lot of data available. And I guess like in all of everything we do today, it's big data, right? There's so much information that's available to us. And how do we take all that information and put it into one location so everyone who's looking can go to that source to make decisions on corridor acquisition or development opportunities or what have you. So just the experience of being around the group of folks who are making these decisions, and we are ranking, we have a rank system or rank opportunities on a facet of different parameters. Be it does the project answer the question to climate change, or any protected species that are represented on this particular property? Does it connect to other properties? Are there critical habitats on that property that needs to be preserved today versus tomorrow? So again, there's a lot of data available, and having the experience in serving on ARC and looking at what Florida Forever does, it's doing a great job, right? But the more arms around it, the better, and I think that's what Florida Wildlife Corridor does. It adds that other structure. There aren't different programs. They're running parallel. You know, there's two canoes going the same direction. And so I see that as what Florida Wildlife Corridor provides and what opportunities that we can continue to learn through Florida Forever and this program. But they're definitely parallel programs, and they should continue to do great things in preserving habitat.
Great, thank you. So the importance of big data, which we have a lot of, and prioritizing, which we've got a lot of work to do on, but nonetheless, thank you, Mo. So Emily, coming over to you, can you tell us a little bit, and Hillary talked about this, but can you talk about the importance of large-scale landscapes and connectivity from a wildlife and a recreation standpoint, and talk a bit more about the economic benefits and impacts from recreation?
Sure. So I have a unique opportunity to work across 5 states, and I want to commend everyone in this room for the efforts here. I think y'all are really leading the way nationally and especially in the Southeast in focusing on landscape scale connectivity. We talk about it in every state, but y'all are putting your money and your work where your mouth is. But from a wildlife standpoint, Betty mentioned it really well. We talk about saving all of these species, and with Ducks Unlimited, we're focused on obviously waterfowl, but also quality wetlands that support hundreds of wildlife species. And so while we can focus our efforts on conserving wildlife, we need to make sure that we have landscapes that can support them and support their populations in a sustainable fashion. And so landscape connectivity is critically important. When you see habitat fragmentation, you start to see declining populations, which then in turn affects the human component of interaction with wildlife. In Florida, you've got over 3 million hunters and anglers. Those folks contribute over $6 billion spent in the state of Florida pursuing these activities. You've got over 4 million just
maybe not consumptive, but outdoor recreationists in the state. And so that's a critically important part of this economy. I think environment and economic development go hand in hand. It creates job creation. It provides for a sustainable natural world and the species that we all depend upon in some way, shape, or form. So I think I want to just commend everyone for what you're doing in this room. It's incredibly important, and it supports not only the dollars in your pocket and the economic vitality of your state, but also the water you drink, the air you breathe, and the species that we utilize to recreate with.
Great, thank you. The environment and the economy, coming back to Betty's point, protecting the economy is protecting home. And in that case, for us, that's the environment. So actually, Betty, I want to come back to you. Through your airboat business, you get to interact with a lot of different people from all around the world, and you have a chance to talk with them about the Everglades, its importance, the changes that you've seen, and why it's important to protect it. Can you tell us what you've learned about what really resonates with people, and is there advice that you have for us about how we can talk about these issues in a way that really connects with people and helps us make the case for protecting this corridor?
I think the one thing that stands out is for all the visitors that come and 90% of our visitors are from other countries. The other 10% is in the United States. And the 90% that come, they can't understand why we don't want to protect it. And when you think of that, because the Everglades, you only have one. If you lose it, you can't go and pick up another one and put it there. And I think through the being able to take out the different groups and what the vision that William Buffalo Tiger, who was our very first elected chairman and also a strong advocate for the environment, he always said that when people have that connection to place and they feel it's theirs too, the more likelihood that they are willing to stand up and save it. Because you have to have an affinity for it, some kind of connection. You've been there. And when you see a threat to it, the more likely you are to call someone, to write someone, to donate to an organization. And in my case, walk around Lake Okeechobee or across the Everglades to educate about it. And education is key in understanding the threats. And when I show the Everglades, the portion we're at, many people who come to Florida only think the Everglades is Everglades National Park. They don't understand the water conservations are also a part of the historic Everglades, or that the historic Everglades started up around, here, around the Kissimmee area. They only think of Everglades National Park. So when you start educating them about the greater Everglades ecosystem, the more they start understanding the importance that you need, because we've divided it all up with all these different names instead of realizing it's the greater Everglades. I wish it would just go back to being called the Everglades and not these water conservation areas, so that even members of the public will understand it's still a part of the Everglades. And education in my line of work is key. And yes, they want to come see alligators, but when you're letting them know water quality is important, the timing of water depths and preserving and having a healing an ecosystem is very important for that alligator to thrive and survive. And we all know that just like the panther, an alligator is also, under that umbrella species, other animals are dependent on him. And when you also teach them that the Everglades, when you look at the earth as a whole, we're the kidneys of the earth. And we all know what happens to the human body when your kidneys go bad, right? So, in our efforts to create this massive dialysis system, Everglades Restoration, you have to understand that, well, if we heal those kidneys of the earth, and if we heal the rainforests in South America, which are the lungs of the earth, indigenous people understand the earth has systems just like the body, and these natural landscapes and the importance of why they need to exist, so the entire earth. And America always, I think it was Governor Graham called the Everglades America's Everglades. I always say the Everglades are the world's Everglades, and everyone has the right and the responsibility to stand up for her. And that's what I always want people to leave with is, it's not America's Everglades. It's your Everglades and your grandchildren's and your future generations' Everglades to come. And it needs to exist so your generations can also come to, enjoy her beauty.
Great. Thank you so much. I mean, as we think about these large landscapes, we have to recognize that they're interconnected and in service of our larger planet. So such great perspective for us all to keep in mind. Gary, I'm going to come to you next and talk about something else that's interconnected, which is the fact that we have a changing climate and we have rapid development, and that is increasing the pressure on us here in Florida and around the world to put these landscape scale corridors together. So can you talk about, I'm sure you've seen this challenge, this urgency play out in different places around the world. So can you talk a little bit about how you might use urgency as a force for good? How can you use urgency to get people aligned, to help people innovate, to get clearer on priorities? Are there any good examples of where you've seen those factors at play?
Well, I think the gold standard for how urgency brought together or marshaled people to solve a major global problem, environmental problem, and that was the Montreal Protocol to deal with the ozone hole. That was rapid intervention to solve a major global problem. Right now we have two co-joined global crises: the loss of biodiversity as well as the climate change. And often these two communities aren't working together. The climate change people think of the atmosphere, the biodiversity people think of the biosphere as if they're not linked. But life interacting creates the conditions that support the atmosphere. So right now, there's a global conversation going on that we have to bring these two communities together to solve the problem, essentially the home problem of our time, which is to address climate change and biodiversity as one. That's why you may have heard of this saving 30% of nature by 2030. It's called 30 by 30. 60 nations around the world are ramping up their conservation efforts because we're not saving enough nature. As I said before, I live right outside of Yellowstone National Park. The park concept, parks alone cannot do it. They have to be connected. They have to work at a scale that nature functions. It's the ecological processes that these connected landscapes and seascapes provide, maintain the biosphere, provide the resilience or the insurance policy to these grand changes that we're seeing. I think that, what Mallory said before, the next 8 years is our moment, is our crisis moment to solve these efforts. And if we can't wait from outsiders to do it. And we have to do it, and we have to inspire each other. So what you're doing in Florida will inspire others in other states, and what we do as a nation will work with other countries, because this is how we're going to respond to this moment of urgency. And as I said before, I just came back from Australia. It's a land of big drought, big fire, big flood, big wind, and extreme weather. And people are suffering. And now they realize they have to take action. And they have to start saving nature at these large scales with collaborative and cooperative means to do so. So I think what we've seen with these many, many landscape initiatives in the US that the Network for Landscape Conservation is trying to bring together is just kind of how we're going to respond. There is going to be no top-down approach. We have to roll up our sleeves and work together across sectors, across cultures, and across jurisdictions to solve this problem. Essentially, in a time when the world is being fragmented politically and in so many ways, this connecting of landscapes and seascapes has to bring us together to solve a mutual problem that affects all our lives.
Well said. Thank you, Gary, so much for that. I'm going to come to Mo or Emily, actually, either or both of you. I'm happy to have you speak to this question. Sticking with the climate theme for a little bit longer. obviously it's always been important to protect wildlife corridors, but could you speak a little bit about the increasing urgency in protecting these corridors in light of climate change? And also, could you speak a little bit about how we further engage the recreational community in this work and helping bring this vision to life?
You want me to take a
Either
stab
one
at
of you?
it?
Emily, you want to go first?
Sure. So, being as someone from the Southeast, unfortunately, everyone figured out the secret sauce that this is a great place to live. And so you're seeing rising development pressures, which climate change is not helping. You're going to be seeing potential migrations of people from the coasts as flooding and coastal inundation may increase. May potentially be seeing increased intensity and frequency of major storm events. But at the same time, you've got development and more people coming to this part of the world. But you also have very sensitive ecological habitats and wildlife that need to be supported. So they too will be needing to migrate just like we as humans will. We all have the basic same needs: water, shelter, food, lack of disturbance on the wildlife side, maybe for some people too. But I think it further amplifies the need for connectivity of habitats, especially to support wildlife. People can move to other states if they need to. A lot of these sensitive species don't have that luxury. And so the work that we're all doing to protect land and restore quality areas while we still can is critically important to the future of both people and their natural enjoyment through hunting or fishing or hiking or birding and other outdoor recreational opportunities, as well as the species that we enjoy viewing and their long-term vitality.
Great, thank you. Mo?
Well, I'd like to answer that from the standpoint of what Betty and Gary have mentioned, and it's about the education component. You know, that's the one thing that's lacking. You know, everyone in this room, we all understand the challenge, the opportunity, the crisis that we're in, but it's that person who, and that layman who is just, you know, going about their job day to day and just living life and looking at how to get my kid in college and pay for college and all that. How do we get them on board, right, to understand the quality of life that could be, they can receive, and also generations to follow, by making some slight changes on a global scale. You know, I'm reminded in the 70s of Woodsy Owl. You guys remember that? Give a hoot, don't
Yes.
pollute. I mean, it changed my whole attitude about polluting. All of a sudden, I became aware of throwing things down, and it changed how the country looked at pollution. It's, of course, today it's probably not that easy as a commercial with Woodsy Owl, but it's the same concept of education. So from my line of work, having to deal and interact with folks on the planning and zoning boards or commissioners for the city or for the county, for them to understand the values of conservation lands, understanding sea level rise, so that they can make better decisions on their comprehensive plan uses or site use, so that when decisions are made about development, you know, they can have a bigger influence on what a development community looks like versus just going in, cutting all the trees down, planting the houses, you know, and then watering the lawns, right? So I think that's one of the big things that we have to do in this room. You know, I think we all need to be a part of a local government board who can be that person who's giving them their ear, say, hey, have you guys thought about this from a landscape scale, right? We're a small part of the piece, but we're all a bunch of pieces being added to the overall picture. And so when people start understanding, it's amazing what people will get behind and start to support if they understand, they have the knowledge of what's at stake.
Great, well said, thank you. I'm going to check the time. We still have a little bit of time left, so I'm going to ask one more question before we open it up for audience Q&A. I'm going to put this question out there for all of our panelists, so you can let me know if you're interested in answering. And it builds off some of the things we just touched on, like the challenge of climate change, the opportunity in educating people, the opportunity in plugging into our own local governments. So could you all speak to what you see as maybe the largest challenges or the biggest opportunities that we have as we work to put this Florida Wildlife Corridor together and protect it for generations to come? So challenges and opportunities that you see ahead of us. Anyone
I'll
wanna
take a
go
stab
first?
at it.
Okay, great, thanks, Betty.
Because I was sitting here thinking about the possibilities, and even when I was listening earlier. And, you know, I think it's great that we have the films, the photographs of these places, and the work that's coming out of it, because a lot of people will understand their visual. I'm a visual learner, so when I see it in a film, it helps bring that picture home. It tells that story, and you have pretty good set of story weavers here. And you have young students that are very starting to get into that area. But we can have all the documentaries, we can have all the pictures, but if we don't save the natural landscapes, that's all we're gonna have, is pictures and film. You're not gonna be able to look out your back window outside of Yellowstone to see the natural landscape. I won't be able to look out my backyard, you know, to see the Everglades, because it's gonna die. It's a fossil of it, it's a living fossil of its former glory. And it's using those different mediums of education, whether it's through film, whether it's through these type of settings, and it's all about educating and making sure we understand the message. Because I've been to Army Corps meetings, state meetings. Those of you who have been to those same meetings, you know my spiel I usually give there. But the one comment I always get from people in the public is, when people speak, it's way up here. They don't understand what's being told to them. So you have to remember, when your audience is people of the general public, you have to give your presentation where they understand. Because when you use even I have to Google sometimes, like, what are they talking about? You know? And that's part of the problem, is that when you're with your own colleagues, they understand your lingo. But when you're talking to a mechanic, a housewife, you know, a laborer, they may not. But if you put it into terms where they'll understand, and I like to do analogies a lot, because if I'm talking to most men that know about mechanics, you know, I'll put my analogy of the environment and I'll relate it to a car, because they understand how a car works. Or whatever it is, I put myself to use things that they understand. And once they get it, they get it. And also, it's a great that's the challenge of the education part and how you package that message. Because we all understand the urgency. You know, we've crossed that line. We're in the point of, we're going down, the further we go, the more days we go, the more years of the point of no return. And I think COVID showed us that when no one could go anywhere, and that nature will heal itself if you get out of the way. And I think the opportunity here is, when you talk about climate change, sea level rise, is when you understand the environment, how important the environment is to help offset that. When you have more green connected spaces, when you can sequester the carbon in the ground, that's better than cutting carbon emissions from vehicle. You know, studies have shown that if you have more green landscape and you keep it in the ground, and the more you can keep in the ground, the more you'll reduce the carbon in the atmosphere. That needs to come into the conversation, and I'm glad to hear that, you know, Florida is looking at, you know, no-till farming to help keep that into the ground. So that's keeping those landscapes is going to help the climate change. And if you understand the connectivity and the importance of in-stream rivers on a landscape that help cool your oceans, because we're diverted all this water and used it for other consumption or shot it in the ground, we're taking all the inland waters away from its ability to get to the oceans to help cool it down. So your oceans are heating up and expanding, and then you have your melting of your ice caps. It's all connected. And it's educating about that, and educating our legislators that it's important, especially here in Florida. We're surrounded by water, but we're commodifying water as, to trade it, but we forget the importance of water in helping the rest of the planet. And so this is a great opportunity in collect, it's not just, when we think about the wildlife corridor for animals, but we also have to think about the health of that wildlife corridor and the maintenance of it. And that's where your budgeting comes in and getting the funding to protect those landscapes. It's great if you designate it, but if you don't take care of it, then it's not a healthy landscape for for everything that has to live there to survive. So you all have to look at all those budgetary costs that is going to go with healing the environment and encouraging programs that reintroduces plants and animal species to that area to help it thrive, to revive it. And that's a great opportunity that you have with these corridors, is to help them flourish. And then also maybe think of educating people to understand that, instead of those non-native plants that they plant in their yards, go with native species. Less stress on the environment of having to put chemicals on it or water. Those are things that the everyday public needs to get more information about. And those are the opportunities that I see.
Great, thank you so much. It's not just about front-end protection, it's about making sure we manage and maintain it to provide all those benefits we're looking for. Thank you, Betty. Any other panelists want to take on the question of challenges or opportunities?
Sure.
Emily?
I think we all recognize that one of the greatest challenges we face is that time is of the essence. I think the next 10 years are going to tell a lot about the future of this state and the future of the world in general. But I think with that comes a lot of opportunity. Obviously, there's a lot of synergy already. There are a lot of partners working in this landscape. There's been great foundations laid by state, federal, NGO partners, county level, water management districts, and conservation work. So a model that works. How do you expand it and speed up the process to do a lot of work in a little bit of time? I think that is your biggest challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And within that opportunity, you have the ability to serve as a model for the rest of the country. And I think that's really, really important to think that this is very big for Florida, but this is bigger than just Florida. It's the entire Atlantic coast and really the whole U.S. and potentially the world.
Great, thank you. We have a great opportunity to be a role model for others here, and we've got a good head start. Gary or Mo, any parting thoughts on this one? Gary?
Well, if you allow, I think that one of the greatest challenges is that people as a species are stubbornly adaptable to our long-term detriment. We are adaptable to the point where we will put up with, where we've disconnected from the signals to change. And that's the problem with climate change and the biodiversity crisis right now. And we're stubborn about it. We can change, but we don't want to because, it just gets in our craw that we don't want to. So if we can coach each other and create a safe environment that change is okay and that we can move forward together, I think that's the challenge and the bar we have to surpass to go forward.
Sadly true, Gary. We are very stubborn, aren't we?
Right.
And Mo, anything to add, or we can?
Nope.
Nope.
Just education.
Education.
It's all about education.
That came through consistently through this panel discussion. I think I'm looking around for those who are going to be helping me, but I think we are going to open it up for Q&A from the audience. I see some, yes.
Raise your hand if you have a question, and then if you have a card, there are cards on your table if you want to write, that'll speed us up. So if you want to write one down, in the meantime, we'll take questions from hands.
All right, looks like we've got our first one while the rest of you write yours down.
My name is Paul Linder. I've been a cattle rancher, citrus grower, retired lawyer. I grew up out in the country. I love the Florida country. One of the things Betty said resonated with me, and that was the comment about maintaining these corridors. I never cease to be amazed at the lack of concern or focus on invasive species, because a good bit of the Everglades area is overtaken by the melaleuca tree, which absolutely destroys the natural environment. Then you have the Chinese tallow tree, Kogan grass, plus a host of invasive animals. So I would just like to state that part of our goal ought to be how to manage these lands in a way that enhances their productivity for the goals we have. Thank you.
Thank you, well said. Like Betty's analogy, you don't buy a house and then just stop maintaining it and hope it's gonna keep providing you all those benefits over the years. You know you've got to invest in its long-term O&M. Other questions? Don't be shy.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm State Representative Daisy Morales. Thank you for your panel. Amazing. Lots of blessings. Betty, we met. You know me.
Yeah, I know you. We stood in the rain for 3 hours together. You can't forget that.
So that tells you a lot. Okay. One of the things that I observed and I noticed is we need to be aware of our real estate business, realtors. Those are the people that are out there buying land, buying property, and we don't know where those properties are located. Now, is there anything that we can do as observants, now that we're learning this, how we can approach those realtors or maybe invite them so they can understand this is where we can, we can communicate, we can bring awareness to them that this is a concern, because they're trying to get more people to buy property, but where are those properties and how are they presenting it to those new owners, and what can those owners do? That's my question.
Any of the panelists want to take on this question around working with realtors in the real estate industry, particularly in a place like Florida, where that's a big part of this
From
puzzle?
a non-realtor, I was traveling from Salt Springs, and I visited a nephew up there and got to kayak the Rainbow River, and I was like, one side is most totally developed, and I was looking on the east side where I saw all these survey markers, and I was thinking in my head, oh my gosh, how many more years before there's all houses on the other side as well? And realtors sell available property, but I would think that has to come at your county level and your state level, as if you're really interested in these places. And traveling back, I cut through the center of the state through Okeechobee, and I saw all these ranching lands up for sale, 300 plus acres, 1,000 plus acres, and I just had a flash of a subdivision there, and I said, oh my gosh, this is going to be horrible if it turns into an urban area, and then all the money being spent on restoration of the different areas, not just the Everglades, but other parts of the state, and also, the wildlife corridor, is that these areas that are for sale, because I was thinking to myself, okay, what stress is the rancher having that he or she feels that that's their only alternative to sell their land? I was thinking, is there a conversation that could be had with them as how that, because, I'm a big proponent of keeping ag land as ag, because I rather see it's have some, because I understand that majority of them and, the ranchers, they know their land. And, once it's a subdivision or a strip mall, there's no one going back. So my thought was, what are the adversities these ranchers and agricultural areas facing that they're feel that that's their only recourse? And I think that has to be the part of the conversation. And when you talk about citrus greening, a lot of people are, moving away from citrus because of their crops. So that's like a soil remediation issue. And I know a scientist that can help with that. Anybody? They have a pilot project in Central Florida where they're actually healing the soil so these citrus crops can come back and flourish. And there's a test pilot. So that's, to me, is finding out what the issues they're having so they're not putting their land up for sale in real estate. But, you know, if there's a property for sale, you know, someone wants to sell their property, the realtor is just facilitating that. So it's probably a homeowner question too as well. And it goes back to starting those conversations and to see what those issues are, because the amount of ranch land I saw up for sale north of Lake Okeechobee was very scary. And that's land that needs to be kept in a natural state and being a working land is what you termed it there. And I think it's part of your wildlife corridor too. So,
thank you so
Temperince,
much.
I can say just briefly on this. My mom was the first woman broker in the state of Maryland. My siblings were all realtors. My mom made me get a realtor's license at the age of 18. And I think there's a great deal of education that's necessary for the realtor community. But here's one thing that I learned. Realtors create communities. The great realtors do. They understand the landscapes. The great realtors they don't look at houses, they see families, they see homes. They see the communities that they interconnect. I think there's an opportunity, you know, for this community to go to the state annual. Every state has their annual realtors meeting. And I don't know if anyone in this audience has done that, but I think there's an education process involved here. I certainly have had a lot of interesting Thanksgiving dinners with my real estate family. But in the end, they really see how they have a role to play in this kind of conservation.
Great, thank you, Gary. And Betty, I think there's a lot of folks in the agricultural community here today that would agree with your statements about being good stewards of the land and the importance of keeping ag and ag. One quick thing I'll add, and then we have another question from the audience. We, the Nature Conservancy, are working with developers, so not necessarily realtors, but developers, to try to prove up better models for development that take conservation into consideration, that make sure they're protecting water resources that are irrigation free or low intensity. And we're trying to prove that these models work, that there's a market for them, and that it's in developers' best interest to do more and more of this. It's a long road to get there, but it's a journey that we're on for the reasons that you mentioned. So additional question along the same lines from the audience. How do we change expectations of scraping land for development or construction? So it's the idea of, clear cutting, when we know planting trees is a key benefit for carbon and biodiversity. Regulatory rules seem to propel this. Anyone on the panel want to speak to that? We were touching on that a bit just a moment ago.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to the local governments and understanding and being a part of their boards, folks like us being a part of those boards to help them understand the values of green space has on their communities. It's the typical, not the stereotype, but the typical developer starts off with, I need X number of homes. I found a piece of property, and deliver me X number of homes, right? And generally they can get that accomplished on the local level. So it's a matter of the local level, local government pushing back and going, you need to maintain some green space. You need to maintain corridors. There's vacant land to your north, vacant land to your south. We need for you to connect to those vacant lands. It's very much a local government initiative. I don't like seeing the, clear cut it all down and plant the houses afterwards and then put trees where you can get them in. But yeah, it's very much an education on the local level of helping them to understand the values to their community today and in the future. Not just the dollars that this home will bring to our economics locally, but the value over time.
Great, thank you. And finding those places, sometimes local governments aren't even aware where regulations may disincentivize some of these practices. So finding those and working with your local government to eliminate those disincentives where you can. Any other questions? Yeah?
Hey there. Can you hear me? Yeah. Meredith Budd with the Florida Wildlife Federation. Thank you, all of you, for all of your responses and insight. I wanted to highlight and touch on something I didn't hear a lot of, which was connecting lands through wildlife crossings. So land is obviously of critical importance. You ought to protect land. We need to see it across the state, especially when we're talking about recovery of wide-ranging species like our endangered Florida panther. I got the notification this morning that a female was hit and killed up in Glades County. I believe it was north of the river. So that's a breeding female that is now gone. So land conservation is of the utmost importance, but it's really challenged when animals like our panther can't get to those lands because they're dying on our roadways. And wildlife mortality is leading, or vehicle strikes, is one of the leading causes for wildlife mortality, I think, globally. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on what are the opportunities you see to consider and to really try to achieve that connected landscape truly with connecting across our roadways, which are killing our wildlife. Thank you.
Thank you. Any of our panelists want to talk about wildlife crossings?
Well,
I can, well, go ahead.
No, I'll defer.
My organization played a key role in getting the $350 million out of the INVEST Act, which is the first ever large sum of money in the transportation bill to support states' efforts for wildlife crossing structures. And we want to see that money increase. We want to see it used effectively, and we want it to be inspiring for wildlife crossing efforts around the world. The challenge we have with this whole field is that people who build roads are linear thinkers. We green buildings, but we don't green roads. I think there's a huge opportunity to look at how to green the whole industry of linear infrastructure development and how these structures fit within landscapes. And these crossings do work, but remember, they only, one crossing in a landscape isn't going to work. It has to be paired with other kind of mitigation measures. In general, you're going to have crossing structures every kilometer if you're going to really have a permeable landscape, and there will be overpasses and underpasses, and there will be culverts, and there will be responsive to the species and the ecology of the area. But it is a hopeful sign that we're seeing this kind of innovation in the U.S. Certainly, I think Beth is going to, from National Wildlife Federation, is going to talk about what's going on with the Wallace-Annenberg crossing in Liberty Canyon in California. But that effort is just one of thousands and thousands of these kind of efforts that are springing up across the nation.
Great, thank you, Gary. Anyone want to add to that?
I'll add to his, and I think he has a good point in that you have to think about the quantity of wildlife crossings. But being an indigenous person, even I was amazed at how high a deer can jump, because I've seen a deer jump over a fence or get hung up in a fence. And along I-75, I see bears put down the fences. You're not stopping a bear. If it wants to go that way, it's going that way. And your fence is just in the way. So it's understanding nature, because animals don't read signs. You can put panther crossing, but the panther doesn't read the sign. It's a creature of habit, and understanding where they cross is to me, sometimes I see design issues I'm like, this doesn't make sense. The raccoon just went around this way and got killed on the road, and he had no escape route. So, when you have a little narrow path, I'm talking about down further south, because sometimes on some of the roads, it's a little narrow path. And so they make the choice to go all the way down to the end, sometimes walk, and they get trapped between fences. So, for me, since I live further south, I'm going to talk about the Alligator Alley and Tamiami Trail. Those should have been bridges all the way across. Then you wouldn't have to worry about wildlife getting hit on I-75 or the Tamiami Trail. So the decisions about, and the comment about road builders being linear thinkers is the designs of the roads. Maybe they need to be designed better, because a fence sometimes traps an animal and it dies. So you have to think about all those scenarios as how best you can design something so the animal has a safer crossing. Because I have seen deer hung up in a fence, and I've seen miles of fence being put down by bears. So that tells you that's, it's not stopping them from trying to cross. So that you have a design issue at that point.
Great, thank you. I can say that at the Nature Conservancy, we've worked on wildlife corridors, crossings as well, a part of our Panther corridor. And we've been working specifically with DOT, so as they're doing road improvements, we're trying to work with them on siting these corridors. And the trick is that you have to have protected land on both sides of the crossing and know that there's not going to be development happening on either side, or they're not interested in investing in a corridor there if there's a potential one end of it's going to turn into a neighborhood. So that's just something to be aware of, and something a lot of people in the room can help us with as we try to identify sites for these, getting the land rights we need so that we can site the corridors and crossings in the right places. Yep. I've got, one more question on a card, and then we've got another hand raised, and I suspect we're running close to time. Let me ask this one. How do we educate and connect with other states like Georgia to extend the corridor connections, potentially to something larger like a southeast corridor? So we know these corridors don't end at our geopolitical boundaries. Any thoughts on how we move past that?
Sure. A lot of us work for national organizations. So while you have the Nature Conservancy's chapter in Florida, you also have a Nature Conservancy in Georgia. Our state agencies work through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and those partnerships exist throughout the Southeast. I think it just takes a little bit of effort and a phone call or an email to set up a meeting. We can all drive across the border. But I think there's a lot of symbiotic motion going on around conservation corridors. And so you'd be pleasantly surprised that there's work taking place, maybe not as officially with official funding and focus, and a symposium like this focused on connecting Georgia to South Carolina to North Carolina. I've got it to Virginia now. There's a lot of work going on by a lot of partners. So all it just takes is communication. And I think we can all help facilitate that.
Thank you. Well said. Do we have, okay. Do we have time for two more? How about that? Two more questions? All right, let's go over here.
Yeah, excuse me. The name is Del Schwalls. I'm with the Florida Floodplain Managers Association. And as I look at this map, I see a lot of our opportunity areas are floodplain. And a lot of those are in under-resourced and fiscally constrained communities. And so whether they're mapped floodplain or not, a lot of the resources that communities have that aren't under-resourced to battle development and to preserve their floodplains are lacking in most of our target areas. So are there programs to work with these fiscally constrained communities to support them as they battle this? You know, they're managing the floodplains, but there's such a good synergy there. Is that part of the focus, and what are we doing?
Anyone want to speak to that? Any of the panelists? Yeah, I think you stumped him.
No, well, I mean, this work is working with people. I mean, you don't get corridors without working with communities and people. So, and you have to understand the context of their lives and the decisions they have to make. So otherwise, these things are paper exercises. So, you know, I don't know, I'm not from Florida, but in my experience working with corridors, there's always a community conversation at some point with someone along this path.
Well, I can't speak for those communities, but I remember being at a meeting, and it was about, wetlands and restorations, and it was a public meeting, and they had, state and government officials there, and there was a comment made by an individual that was from a town, and it was an official, and he was saying, well, you want to protect these places, but they are, strapped for cash, I guess, because of your tax base. And he had the question, when you take this off my tax rolls, how are you going to help my community? So that's the conversation that has to happen, is when you take that land out of their tax rolls, what are you going to put to replace that they use to run their government and to provide their services? So that's a part of the conversation of, maybe it's happening somewhere, I don't know, but it seems to be that is a part of that and no one had an answer for him. What programs they're gonna help that county when it's taken off their tax rolls? What incentives are there? Or can it be a working a working property? Something, a program that is available to them. I would hope if that's not a part of the conversation, it needs to be a part of the conversation.
Thank you. There are some programs in place to look at those issues, but I think we all know we can do a lot more and are going to need to do a lot more to be successful with this corridor and some of these communities that just aren't in the position that others are. I think we've got one last question from this gentleman. I think he's been waiting.
Oh, sure.
Sorry.
I'm Bert Eno. I'm the president of Rainbow River Conservation. 2 points about the trees, telling people or appealing to the counties to prevent people from cutting trees. I think 2 years ago, the legislature passed a law that says that local governments can't tell people what to do with their trees on their own land. I know in the city of Denellen that people that would complain about somebody cutting trees on their property was dismissed because the city says, well, we can't tell them what to do with any trees on their property. The other issue that I have is that the Northern Turnpike extension, that is being proposed now, dictated by the legislature, as a matter of fact, to be studied and considered. There's 4 possible routes being considered by the DOT, and 3 of those routes cut into Marion County, where I live, and 2 of them, in fact, cut right across the primary recharge basin of the Rainbow River. There is no sense whatsoever that I can see in this turnpike extension to carry traffic from where the extension ends now at Wildwood over to the west coast of Florida and up along the sensitive areas along the coast. It sounds like a just tremendous boondoggle. All it's going to do is invite more traffic and more destruction of the wildlife. And in fact, I talked just a week ago with a rancher that recently bought 5,000 acres west of the Denellen area, and I informed him that one of the preferred routes is right smack through the middle of his 5,000 acres. Well, I upset him, and he says, well, I'm a rancher, I'm not a developer. I certainly don't want a corridor like that coming right through the middle of my property. How can we prevent the DOT and the legislature from proposing such foolish things?
Well, thank you, and I think that relates to something Carlton was mentioning earlier, that as our state grows, we have continued pressure for new transportation corridors, and we are going to have to continue to work to make sure that as those things are considered, the corridor and species issues and connectivity are all a part of the considerations. We were successful, as Carlton pointed out, in helping with these last few suggestions for new roadways and making a good case for why they weren't a good idea. And I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us doing much of the same. So with that, I think I'm getting the time. Oh, one last question. Okay. Yeah.
My name is Martina. Thank you for having me. You guys mentioned it's all about education. We know that. But oftentimes, I think we come into problems because bridges cost millions of dollars to build, and legislation that takes a lot of effort and people coming together, and that's why we don't see very much of them. I created a proposal to use Google Maps as a form of conservation through navigation, and I wanted to know what you guys think about using technology as a form of conservation and how that could be a route for the generations to come.
Great. Any of our panelists want to speak about
Yeah,
the role of technology?
Yeah, that is a big importance. I mean, that's part of the whole data, giant data. Let's get it into everybody's hands, and they can look at a map and see Florida corridor lands and see Florida Forever lands, and see ranch lands and the opportunities to protect those, that's huge, big data. Being able to put it all in one location, right, and we all have access to it. That's huge. That would be huge.
Yeah, another tool that's been
I
talked
have
about is using virtual reality, believe it or not, to the point of people need to connect to a place to care about it. And can you use virtual reality to expose a person to the power of a place and its importance, even if they aren't necessarily able to go there? And Gary, you wanted to add?
Well, I just say, well, in the health industry, we use MRIs and PET scans. We now have revolutionary imaging of the human body in time and space, where you can make decisions about the dynamic aspects of the body. We're still stuck with GIS snapshots of lands as if a point in time. We now have the ability with remote sensing and new technologies to see the dynamism, the life force of land, the seasonality, the fragmentation process at real time. And we're not making decisions based on those that dynamic information. And I feel like in the next 10 years, you're going to see a revolution, in the way we start looking at landscapes in this kind of dynamic imaging.
Yeah, thanks, Gary.
I wanted to add something, and you're going to laugh, but I think it's interesting. But and I'm thinking if these individuals can do it, surely there's capable people in this room that can come up with something. And sometimes, because I live in the swamp, sometimes I watch shows about finding Bigfoot. And I was watching this one show where there's individual, and there was a show recently filmed in Florida, and they were looking for the skunk ape. And they were using this technology of mapping. And they were, every sighting that was put up, and they were tracking the trends at when they spiked and when they didn't. Kind of like if you're tracking a bear or a panther, right? Same concept. So they were able to zero in on areas of where they would have the most likelihood to have a sighting or hear a twig snap or something. But that being said, when you're looking at technology and landscapes, you have the data of people tracking bear, panthers, and everything else that if it was more interactive, you get a better, in this I was thinking, that's adaptable, not just for Bigfoot, you can put other animals in there. And then you can have, and it was very scientific of how this individual went by it, and I'm like, that's technology that could be applicable in other places. So if a Bigfoot researcher can do it, y'all can do it too. And that's my point. And the virtual reality, that is something that is happening. And 4 years ago, there was a university professor of UM was creating this interactive program so that wherever you are out in the world, you can see different landscapes. And that was the first time I've seen it looked like a disco ball, a 3D camera. They mounted it onto the boat, and we had it out in the swamps, and they were filming so that people who were in low-income communities that can't travel to other states could put on the goggles and be anywhere in Florida, whether it's out, diving and seeing the coral reefs or being in an airboat in the Everglades. And then another gentleman created, it was almost like a kayaking tour. And again, I took him out to film with a 3D camera so that when you put on the goggles, they actually had you sit in a kayak and you were going through the mangrove tunnels or on an airboat tour. And they were trying to bring these natural landscapes to a broader community using technology. And I thought, when they asked, would you be a part of this? I said, sure, because that was another way to educate about those areas and bring it into, the classrooms or wherever. And you could they also had stories and information about the place when you went to the website, and you could click on it and put your glasses on and you could be there. So I think it's very important to use the technology that we have today to help protect. It's just another tool in your toolbox to help protect these landscapes.
Thank you, Betty. Betty has the final word. If the Bigfoot scientists can do it, so
you
can
can
we.
do it.
There
you
you
can
go.
do it too.
That's our challenge, folks. And with that, a round of applause. All right, thank you very much.